Welcome everyone. So, namaste, assalamu alaikum, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all of you, depending on the time zone in which you live. Because as we know, there are always people in this meeting from all parts of the world. And according to Dr. Kogi, it is after 9 p.m. in South Africa. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago, a teacher for the past 14 years. And this is the 128th edition of our Zoom public meeting. We wish to sincerely thank all those who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora Global Project. For 127 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. In the past 2 years, 7 months, and 2 weeks, we have featured over 431 presenters from all parts of the world, speaking on 127 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, which is a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. And like today, we often partner with the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Dabidine. So welcome, Professor. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are asking that you can kindly give us your suggestions as well as donations, and you can contact Dr. Mahabir for details. So next week, we have a Sunday get-together, which is going to be live, and persons can register to be there in person once you are in Trinidad and Tobago. And it's a recording for eats, entertainment, and education with an emphasis on roti making. So you're going to make homemade, fresh roti, healthy juices. We will also have music, dance, and interviews. And this is going to be in Cunupia, Trinidad and Tobago. So I hope we have many people joining us then. Ladies and gentlemen, our moderator for this evening or tonight is Shalama Mohammed, the co-director of the Zoom platform, who is a business teacher and researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA, and she's a strong advocate for health and wellness practices based on traditional and alternative healing. So Shalama, welcome. Please take over from here.
Thank you so much, Shakir. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Namaste, and a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for choosing to spend this part of your Sunday or your Monday morning with us. Today's public meeting will take the usual form of a panel presentation, followed by questions and answers. Let me remind you, that in order to avoid trolls invading our program, our IT manager, Rabin Ram Singh, has muted everyone. Speakers are advised to not admit anyone or unmute anyone or allow anyone to share your screens, please. Thank you. Today's meeting, like the others, should not exceed 2 hours. And we are talking today about the 162nd anniversary of the arrival of Indians in South Africa. And they would have arrived from November 16th, 1860. So contemporary Indian South Africans are descendants of those indentured laborers and free migrants who left British India from 1860 onwards. On November 16, 1860, the ship named SS Truro carried 342 indentured Indians from Madras to South Africa, marking the beginning of a long and eventful period in history. The South African Indian community is associated with Mahatma Gandhi, whose 21 years in the country were formative in his mission to lead India's freedom struggle. Today, Indians of South Africa constitute the second largest ethnic group, approximately 1.5 million as of 2021. The majority live in and around the city of Durban and KwaZulu-Natal, making it home to the largest population of Indians outside of India. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us now hear what some of those descendants have to say about the impact of arrival of Indians to South Africa. And our first distinguished speaker is Professor Ghulam Wahid, a history professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal with an interest in colonial encounters, transformations of Indian identities, Islam, and Muslims in South Africa. His presentation was pre-recorded, and we will now share that with you. So Robin, can you bring that up, please?
So today we will give a short presentation on indentured migration to Natal between 1860 and 1911. The Indian indenture, of course, resulted from two separate factors that converged. One was the chronic labor shortage that followed the emancipation of slaves, and two, the new phase of imperialism in the 19th century that resulted in Western capital, settlers, and technology expanding into many new parts of the world. One result of this was that sugar was now cultivated in areas that had not previously known slavery. And good examples are Natal and Fiji. So this export of indentured labor in the 19th century then coincided with what some have called a golden age of imperialism. You know, Emmanuel Wallerstein in his world systems theory speaks of the capitalist system that originated in 16th century Europe, when traders began to establish connections with other parts of the globe. Now, these European powers then profited from these colonies and developed their own economies. And it involved the movement of white settlers in large numbers to the Americas, to Fiji, to Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and Canada. And many, the late 18th century saw the spread of empires, so that you had, for example, Britain acquiring Trinidad from Spain, Mauritius from France in 1810, British Guyana from Holland, the Cape Colony from Holland in 1806, and progressively settling Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and annexing Natal in the 1840s and Fiji. So the demand for sugar then resulted, as a result of changing tastes of the middle class. And there was a rise in the global production of cane sugar from 300,000 tons in 1790 to 10 million tons in 1914. Now, to remain profitable, planters needed a steady supply of cheap labor. And the, emancipation of slavery did not help, because it created a labor crisis in these various colonies. And one solution to this was found in Indian indentured labor. Now that you are well aware of that particular story. We know that slave recruitment was outlawed in the British colonies in 1807, and by 1830 the slave population began to drop, creating a shortage of slavery which pushed the price up. And eventually, the abolitionist movement forced the hand of the British government to outlaw slavery in 1833. Now, the British feared that these colonies, the plantations, faced economic collapse, and they compensated the planters. Ironically, the slaves and their descendants did not get any compensation. So there was concern on all sides about how to remain profitable, and it was in this context that the British turned to indentured labor, starting from Mauritius, but as you can see, they spread to all parts of the world, and the system would continue into the 20th century. So the sugar plantations were across the coast of Natal, northwards and southwards. Inland you had tea, as well as wattle plantations where indentured workers also. While the Belvedere left Calcutta on 4th of October 1860 And the Truro left Madras on 12th of October, which is a week later. The Truro actually reached Natal first on 16th of November 1860 because of the shorter travel distance. So these are actually the only photos that we have of indentured workers with the numbers. I know in Mauritius they have hundreds of thousands of photographs, but for Natal these are the only ones we have. And this was actually produced by the government in a 1950s production where it tried to show how well off Indians were in South Africa. And so our feeling is that if they were able to produce this, then these photographs must be existing somewhere. But to date, unfortunately, we have not been able to find these. So these were migrants 7,358 to 7,377. So clearly it suggests to me at least that these photographs must be somewhere, but nobody has been able to locate them. So this is an example of an immigration certificate which contained the details of the migrant from, again you can see there is a photograph on it, so therefore there must be photographs elsewhere. But the age, caste, height, next of kin, all of these details were recorded. So in terms of the contract that they signed, the indentured agreed to work for a period of, initially it was 3 years and then it was extended to 5 years. And they had to perform whatever task was assigned to them, and then at the end of 5 years, they were either free to re-indenture or seek work elsewhere in Natal. Although they were entitled to a free passage, most of them opted to remain in Natal, and this posed a problem for the Natal government because eventually it reached a stage where the Indian population was in excess of the white population, and at that point they tried to negotiate with the Indian government to actually force the indentured to return to India at the end of the contract, but then the Indian stroke British government refused to agree to that. And what then the outcome of that was that in the 1890s they began to pass discriminatory legislation against Indians so that they became second-class citizens in the colony. So what is remarkable here, and in the next few slides that you will see, is that only around 60%, so Indians were the majority of workers on the sugar plantations, but, and it is important to keep in mind, that only about 60% of the workers worked on the sugar plantations. The rest of them worked in all different kinds of work. So they were instrumental in extending the Natal railway line. Some worked as domestic assistants. They worked in all the municipalities, Durban as well as Pietermaritzburg. Maybe 3,000 or 4,000 were assigned to work as municipal workers. And also they worked in the immigration department. So as you can see, unlike maybe other colonies here, the workers had a variety of options in terms of the kind of work they do. And you find that where the sugar plantations are concerned, Maureen Swan has written that there is a solid weight of evidence in the protector's file to suggest that overwork, malnourishment and squalid living conditions form the pattern of daily life for most agricultural workers. And it was this, of course, which prompted Hugh Tinker to write that social and economic life in the estates amounted to a new system of slavery, but that is a view that is in contention, that is contested, I should say. So Indians were, migrants were brought for their special skills. For example, the African Boating Company requested boatmen who had skills in boating, and then the Indians were also known for their skills as waiters. The Royal Hotel was the main hotel in Durban, and it employed Indians as waiters, and this is the head waiter of the hotel. So Indians actually dominated the hotel, the trade as waiters until I would say the 1980s in Durban. No matter where you went, whether it was a country estate or a hotel or even the restaurants, the waiters were almost always Indians. It was only from the 1990s that they began to be replaced by the African waiters and waitresses. But until that point, Indians dominated the industry. So the next few slides, you'll just see some photographs of women, either towards the end of the indenture or in the post-indenture period, but they just show the ways in which they projected themselves as modern, in inverted commas, individuals. I mean, and many of the reports speak of the extravagant jewelry that women wore, the kinds of dress that they wore, and also, the early educated Indians, seem to have embraced Western dress, and also they established family life very quickly. So you'll see that in the next few slides. As with almost every colony, the Muharram festivities were very popular, and they became a community activity in which what's significant is that both Hindus and Muslims participated. In fact, the majority of participants were usually Hindus, and the whites referred to this, as you can see from this particular, the writing at the bottom. They called it Coolie Christmas processions. But they were very popular and remained until sort of the early 20th century, when the authorities began to clamp down because they regarded it as a public nuisance, because invariably it ended up in a conflict between participants from different plantations. So the opportunities for education were very limited in the early formative decades, because the state did not provide any facilities. This was left to mission schools. So large numbers of, I would not say large, but some Indians did make use of these schools and acquire an education. But by and large, parents were reluctant to send their children to these mission schools because they feared proselytization. In addition, there was a question of poverty, so children had to go out to work. It was only with the Cape Town Agreement of 1927 that provided an impetus for the building of more schools. Now, all the schools in this period were what came to be known as state-aided. In other words, each community built its own school, and the government then provided the teachers. So as you can see, this was a communal effort. It was only in the 1960s, when Indians were accepted as citizens of South Africa, and a separate Department of Indian Education was created, that there was a massification of education, the creation of an Indian university, and the emergence of a strong professional class. So Gandhi plays an important role in Natal. He was here from 1893 to 1914, bar a few years when he returned to India to bring his family or on a political mission that he went on. But he becomes a very significant figure because in the 1890s, the settler government passed a myriad of laws which sought to disenfranchise Indians, restrict Indian immigration, and in general just render Indians as second-class citizens. They even tried to get them to live in separate segregated locations, and by and large Indians lived in separate areas. So this is Gandhi and Kallenbach and Sonia, his assistant, but also Gandhi and his family. And so he is a pivotal figure in this period. Now, one of the most significant events that took place was in 1912 when the Indian nationalist leader Gokhale visited the country. And he really was, he toured the country as virtually a state representative. And as you can see, thousands and thousands of people turned out to meet him. And this is at Albert Park in Durban, where they welcome India's noble son. So he galvanized Indians and Indian consciousness and created a sense of a national belonging. And so he was also a very strong supporter of Gandhi, who relied on him for counsel and advice. And so Gandhi's movement then culminated in a 1913 strike. And its success was due to the fact that thousands of coal miners from northern Natal joined the strike, women passive resistance joined the strike, and here you have a widow whose husband was shot dead on Mount Edgecombe Estate. In fact, a number of Indian protesters were shot dead. But this strike in 1913 crippled the sugar industry. It also created fear amongst the British that the Indians in India would react angrily to what was going on in Natal, and so they feared a sort of protest movements in India, and they therefore implored Smuts to reach an agreement with Gandhi, and that was an agreement reached in 1914. And that particular agreement, generally it sort of allowed some concessions. For example, Indian marriages were recognized, but on the whole, it left Indians as second-class citizens. So, and throughout the apartheid period, they were second-class citizens. They did not enjoy the rights accorded to that whites enjoyed, for example. And Gandhi then leaves in 1914. In the meanwhile, indenture itself was ended in 1911 in Natal. So this is different from other colonies where officially, it ended in 1920. In 1911, it ended because the Indians thought that they would threaten the government that if they did not improve conditions for local Indians, they would stop indenture. But the South African government itself wanted to stop further Indian immigration because it had already passed laws that made African people into second-class citizens and had rendered them effectively, sort of pushed them off their land, made it very difficult for them to exist on subsistence farming. And with the result, then thousands of Africans were available to work on the sugar plantations. So indenture in Natal comes to an end in 1911. The strike took place in 1913, and Gandhi left in 1914. Thank you.
That was an extremely interesting and enlightening presentation. And I want to say thank you so much to Professor Ghulam Wahid in absentia. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move on to our second distinguished speaker. And this person is no stranger to us. This is Dr. Kogi Lam Partha. She's a research associate at the University of South Africa. She's also the series editor of Tell Your Mother's Story, a publication of the Oral History Association. Welcome, Kogi. You can go ahead. Can you unmute? I think you're unmuted now.
Thank you, Salima. Is my slide, Ravin? I'm waiting for Ravin. Okay, thank you. Okay. Good evening, good morning, good day. Namaskar, Prem Namaste, Vanakkam, Assalamu Alaikum, Sani Bonani. Sani Bonani is the Isi Zulu greeting to multiple people, which means I see you. Ladies and gentlemen, Ravin, the next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, my presentation is based on female indentureship and current descendants, and my topic is the legacy they left. In order to present this evening, I decided to streamline my sample to triangulate with some aspects of the research that I've worked on over the decades. In 1993, for a master's degree in orality literacy studies, I focused on the transmission of culture among South African Tamil Indians, and it emerged that women in this South African community were the primary carriers and main channels of tradition, culture, values, morality, norms, dress, cuisine, and so much more. Post-studies have indicated the same results for other language groups within the South African Indian community. South African Indian women, despite being triply disadvantaged, were also politically, socially, legally, and economically oppressed before 1994. But they made it their duty to uphold what was inherently transported from motherland India. However, it must be remembered that they modified aspects of traditional expectations, they improvised where religious anticipations could not be achieved, and they created avenues to encourage and keep hope, faith, and prayer alive. These women of indentured heritage allowed their children access to ancestral heritage. So despite long days at work, either in the home or in an industrial setting, they carried the responsibility of ensuring that South African-born children maintained aspects of their Indian heritage, and it must be agreed that this was not done solo, but until the 60s, predominantly in communal family setups. Post-1960s, many more women ventured into agricultural work, factory employment, education, nursing, and other working environments. Thanks, Ravin, for moving the slide. And this is the correct slide for now. So moving on, in 2009, I joined an NGO, the 1860 Indentured Laborers Foundation, Verulam, headed by 92-year-old Mr. J.S. Singh. This organization is based in KwaZulu-Natal, and I hold the portfolio of research and development. In 2020, I edited a publication entitled 1860s #160, which was launched on a virtual platform where Ila Gandhi was our guest speaker. Some papers that were presented by female academics and researchers, such as Dr. Dhanasegri Govender, Dr. Devi Rajab, Dr. Lubna Nadvi, Dr. Betty Govindan, and Dr. now Professor Kalpana Hiralal, were included in this publication. Their papers were presented at conferences hosted by the 1860 Indentured Laborers Foundation in Verulam. I am now quoting Dr. Betty Govindan, where she states in one of her writings, and I quote, "I was born in Kersney, on the north coast of Natal in South Africa, some 60 miles from Durban. the seaport town along the Indian Ocean. It was on the north and south coasts of Natal where the early sugar plantations were developed through the work of Indian indentured laborers. We lived in a barracks. The place was called Old Tea Factory, and a few miles away was New Tea Factory, where Hewlett's, I remember, had a grand palatial home. My maternal grandmother came with her parents and 3 brothers and 3 sisters in 1904 from Nellore in Andhra Pradesh in India, where she was born in 1896, a year before Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. My grandmother's youngest brother, Vasavia Moses Saul, had actually been born on the ship en route to South Africa. Her family was sent to work in Curzony at Hewlett's Estates, a name in South Africa that is synonymous with sugar. Curzony was controlled by Sir John Hewlett, a sugar baron who was Prime Minister of Natal in 1903. The Hewlett dynasty continued in successive decades and were to dominate our family stories for many years to come, with members of successive generations being in their employ. My grandmother began working immediately as a child laborer. Historians have pointed out that the most intensive use of women's labor on plantations was made by the tea estates in Curzony. Young women were seen to be particularly suited for this job, as they were considered to have small, deft fingers, unquote. So this is just one account to introduce my paper. I then move on, but we remain on the slide, to the work that I have done since 2009. In 2012, I presented a paper at the National Oral History Conference in Bloemfontein in the Free State Province, which was Afrikaner territory, and my presentation was based on the South African women of Indian heritage who were part of the liberation struggle. And for this paper, and for this research-based paper, I interviewed Pinky Kono, who left the country on a passport, Urmila Soni Singh, who was part of the mass mobilization within the country, and Rajas Pillay, who was forced into exile. This month, a follow-up article was presented on Rajas Pillay. She is one of 2 known Umkhonto we Sizwe soldiers who were part of the liberation struggle. And the paper that I presented is entitled Reflective Memories, a chronicle of the liberation struggle experiences of Comrade Ray Pillay, a South African Umkhonto we Sizwe female soldier of indentured Indian diasporic heritage. This paper is included in yet another publication of the 1860 Indentured Laborers Foundation, Verulam, and it is edited by Professor Shanta Balgoban Singh, and it will be launched next Sunday, the 20th of November, 2022 at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Next slide, please. In terms of South African Indian female stories, I'm going to list the titles from the coffee table publication, Tell Your Mother's Story, which presents true but creatively written stories on the women in their families and communities who have made an impact either on their family, their community, or society at large. In volume 1, 2018, we have a story that was submitted by Anisha Constant, who is now living in Thailand, and her story was My Aunt, Mrs. Sarah Sardo. Next, we have 29 July 1956, Tea Estate, Inanda, My Story, written by Devi Munian. Next, My Story, the second generation of Indians that came to Natal, South Africa, by Sumantra Foley, who is now late. She passed on in 2020. Next is Mrs. Rosie Govender, My Mother Toiled, by Pam Naidu. Next is My Aji, paternal grandmother, Mrs. Saras Harinarayan. Next story by Dr. Dhanasegri Govender is entitled My Amma Devagi Goundan. Next is My Grandmother, Mrs. Thakurin Singh by Mr. J.S. Singh. And Mr. J.S. Singh's grandmother arrived in our country in 1895, and she passed on in 1959. Next is a story of my mother, written by my son, entitled My Grandmother, Mrs. Maggie Archery, a leader in the Vedlam community. And then I'm now moving on to the next slide with volume 2. Okay, so yeah, we can move on to the next slide. Right. So here we have Abigail Govender, who was a 9-year-old writer at the time, and she wrote a story on her grandmother, and she entitled it Vasanti Naidu. And then we have a school principal, Daya Naidu, who submitted her mother's story entitled Lakshmi's Story. And we have another story by Kavasha Kenda, where she wrote on her grandmother, and she entitled it An Eternal Love Letter. And we have Nirosh Naidu also writing on her mother, whom she called Mom. Following on, we have another article by Hazel Lachman entitled My Mom, My Inspiration. And I had written a poem on my mother. My mother's name is Megendri, and I entitled it The Pearl. And finally, I also wrote a story on my grandmother, and I called it My Grandmother, My Amma. So we now move on to volume 3, which was launched in 2020. The next slide, please. So here we have one of the stories written by Dr. Devi Rajab, and she wrote a story on her mom, who is still alive. And in 2020, she entitled this story From Horse Carts to Space Travel, My Mother at 104. We had a student, Tervan Govender, writing on his mom, Chantal Govender, and my mother's story. Mr. K.R. Sitaram, who was on our program last week, published a story on his mother, and he entitled it My Beloved Mother, Mrs. Tanpati Ramsaran Sitaram. And we had another story written by Hazel Lachman entitled Manti Kumari Lachman, Our Icon and Beacon of Love, and she wrote on her mother-in-law. Can we then move on to the next slide? Okay, and we have a story by another student, Farah Ahmed, and she wrote about her grandmother. And we have a story from Karusha Ganga, who is now living in Australia, and she wrote a story on her mother entitled Vasugi Reddy was a woman of great determination in life. Our next author was Dr. Kasturi Vali, who now lives in the United Kingdom, and she entitled her story Classified as Freight, Working at an International Atomic Energy Agency in a Wheelchair. And she had implemented lots of changes at the Vienna International Center because of her experiences there working in a wheelchair. Our next story is from Reshma Badri, entitled My Mum, Mrs. Seemad Kusial, a beautiful lady at 74. And our fifth story was Our Lighthouse, Nishla Kanda, written by her daughter, Kavasha Kanda. We can move on to the next slide. So whilst these slides are moving, I just want to create this impression of the divergence, the excellence, the difference, the difficulties, and how people remember those that are still with us, and also those that have left us. So in volume 4, last year, right, we had a story written by Kasturi Vali on her amazing mother who was born in 1921. And she says, my amazing mother, Nagamal Pillai, qualified as a teacher in 1938. And this is some 70 odd years after the first, Indians arrived in our country. Adelaide Joseph has passed on last week at age post 90. And she wrote a story about her mother. My mother was well ahead of her time. And Adelaide Joseph left our country in the 1960s and went into exile because she was a political activist. Next was a story by Sally Iyer, and it was entitled Devotion and Service to Family, Community, and the Freedom Struggle. Yet another freedom struggle fighter who left South Africa, because of apartheid. Ami Nanakchan, a very well-accomplished journalist of note, wrote a story on his mother, Pandit Prabhavati Nanakchand, a political activist and scriptural guru. And we are moving on now to the next writer, who was Lakshmi Premi. Lakshmi Premi, okay, and her title is "As a Child, I Did Not Have a Voice," and she now lives in the Netherlands, and is practicing her craft in terms of her outreach, and in terms of this hidden voice that she mentions. Next, we had a poem from Rayanta Rana, who also lives in the United Kingdom, and she wrote a poem, Ode to a Mother So Divine. Next, we have a story, the next slide. Yeah, the next slide. Yeah, next we have a story by Desiree Perumal, who captured, the story of the Indian woman by titling her paper, Some Heroines Wear a White Sari. We have another story by Govindama Mudli. My grandparents went back to India, and in this story, her father remained, even though her grandparents went back to India. And he was probably about 10 or 11 years of age at the time. Next is a three-legged pot sizzled over the open fire. And this was a story submitted by Nalini Pancham. And we have twins, Roxana Kishore and Ramola Maharaj, who submitted their story on their mom, Basmati Besesar, who was born on Zaylaga farm. Varsha Singh submitted her mother's journey. Her mother was Premila Gokul Sitaram. Shireen Singh, who now lives in the United Arab Emirates, submitted her story entitled 21st January 2013 was a day of reflection and sudden realization, because that was the day she lost her mom. And when I asked her to write, she decided to title her story as such. Kamini Mudli, who is now married, entitled her paper, My Future Mother-in-Law, with the present title of Savior. And finally, in volume 4, we had 9-year-old Abigail again writing a story, this time about the woman who took care of her father when her father was orphaned at age 9. I'm now on to volume 5 and approaching the end of my presentation. Next slide. So for volume 5, we had Fatima Mir, who wrote a story on, we had Devi Rajab, who wrote a story on Fatima Mir, and she called it The Voice of the Dispossessed. And Fatima Mir was born in 1928 and passed on in 2010. Our next story was by Leshna Seikulal, who entitled her piece, Her Elegance and Angelic Grace, the story of my mother, Renu Seikulal. Nikita Reddy paid tribute to her mother, who's currently a professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and that piece is entitled My Mother's Journey from a Paramedic to a Professor. Dr. Rajendran Governor, who is a social advocate in our country, paid tribute to his mother, Pachyama Govender. And then we have Pandit Shobhana Singh, who acknowledged the work done by Mrs. Nalini Mangal in terms of the Vedic Cultural Center in Pietermaritzburg. And then Kubashni Perumal, who is hard of hearing, submitted a story on her mother entitled My Best Friend's Life's Journey, My Mum. And the last story to appear in volume 5 was by Lucinda Arulapan, and she entitled it A Force to Be, because her mother really challenged the boundaries. So in terms of, the topics, the titles, one can see how varied, and how interesting the journeys have been of ordinary South Africans. So I now move on to my next slide, which is early female indentureship. And the next slide. Right, so from these titles of creative works, one can clearly see that the passion that South Africans have for their forebears, especially the mother figure, when there is an opportunity to decorate their memory, pay tribute, and create homage, there is no doubt, no delay, and definitely no deliberation on the matter. South African Indians, especially those born before 1970 and now over 50 years of age, and thus this mature approach to life sees them looking for answers, and this cohort are ready to pay tribute to the legacy that indentured women and later female descendants have left. I now bring attention to early indentureship, because this is the way it all started, and that is how we have come to have this legacy. All of the above articles, papers, and stories were able to be researched and written because at one point in time, one young Indian-born female decided to take a giant leap, step boldly onto a ship, and set sail for an unknown destiny. How brave she must have been. Can we all just imagine that? I now tell the story of Mrs. Thakurin Singh because she sparked an interest in me. Through the personal testimony and reflective memories of her grandson, Mr. J.S. Singh, I have written academic papers on her, and these have been published in accredited journals that use a double-blind review process. The next slide, please. So from these titles, you can see I have had many interviews with Mr. J.S. Singh. And, what has emerged is that his grandmother came to this country in 1895. She lost her husband in the year 1908, but she made the choice not to go back to India. Even though she had two small children, she remained in this country, and she then allowed her children to grow up, become citizens of this country, and that is an example of how we as South Africans pay tribute to those that came before us because they chose not to return to India, and we have the type of life that we have. Thank you.
Kogi, thank you very much for that very insightful presentation, and really speaks to Ma. Ma is so important to all of us in the diaspora, irrespective of where we are. Thank you for pointing that out and reminding us. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to our third speaker, and this is Dr. Nanda Suban. Thank you so much for having patience, sir. He's an award-winning, internationally acclaimed political cartoonist, artist, journalist, and animator. Published in the Post, Independent, Daily News, Sunday Tribune, and many others. So welcome, Dr. Subin. You can go ahead with your presentation.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. I think someone else is controlling my...
Yes.
Yeah, this is where it starts. Cutting cane to cutting edge. That's the reflection of Indians in the diaspora. We've actually, we carved a niche with a cane knife. The Indians in South Africa, I actually added sunglasses to this drawing to show the swag that we had. When there's something about the Indians in South Africa where during the struggle, we've had people like Srini Bodley, Seth Cooper, Kumi Naidu, Jay Naidu, who had that swag when they went onto the platform and spoke against apartheid next to Mandela. There was something special about them, and that's what reflected the way the Indians were, the indentured Indians were. They had some kind of a swag. We just didn't care about all those roadblocks. We actually went and removed things. We fought for rights. Yeah, we can move on to the next. We came here to cut the grass and grow the cane. Surprise, surprise, we even built schools, educated ourselves, helped build this country and liberate it. The grass any greener, or the juice any sweeter. There's a joke about Indians. We planted the grass and we smoked it. We cut the cane and we drank it. There's the alcohol, the cane split alcohol called mainstay. And there's a joke about Indians smoking the grass and drinking the cane. You can move to my next. They shipped out and we shaped it. This is a cartoon that I did for the Post newspaper. use a cane and a cane knife to show we shaped South Africa, and it's a true story. We actually made a big difference to this country. It's not just our intellect and our fighting spirit for the liberation of this country, but also our food. And we have a special dish. It's called a bani chow. It's curry put into bread, and I actually call it fine dining. I actually said I went on a date, and I had a bani chow with a rich man's daughter, who turned out to be my wife in the end. We had a bani chow which is cheap, really, but it's like really fine dining. You can move to the next. You can move. Yeah, this is my calendar, which celebrated 160 years of indenture. On the top frame, you see Valiama. Valiama marched with Gandhi in the strike in 1913, in the passive resistance strike. It was a non-violent strike. And she was detained by the police, and she died in detention. You can see there's Zumba dancing in the bottom. That commemorated 100 years of strikes in South Africa with the massacre that took place in South Africa, which was during the time of Jacob Zuma. And that is actually a long story about that strike, the massacre that took place where the police shot down striking mine workers. The one on the right is Aziz Assam. He was a famous author. He wrote The Lotus People. And then the one below is Navani Pillai. She was the United Nations human rights judge. On the right, Kumi Naidu. He was in charge of Greenpeace and Amnesty International. I don't think you can see maybe the picture is too big. This Sunny Pillai on the right, he was as good a singer as Frank Sinatra. He had to leave South Africa and he went to New York. And when he got to New York, he wasn't able to fulfill his ambitions to be able to become a famous singer because he had TB. And then on the left of that is Ronnie Governor, who won the Commonwealth Writers Award. And his daughter was a firebrand in Parliament, and she resigned from Parliament. Her name was Craig's Governor. And below that, I think there's Dara Mon, was a famous football player. He was one of the greatest football players that I've ever seen. And I lived in Brazil. I've seen Brazilian football. Dara Mon scored a first-half hat-trick against the famous South African team called Orlando Pirates. He scored 3 goals before halftime, and the game was abandoned because Orlando Pirates fans rushed onto the field and abandoned the game. And then I think on next to him, which you can't see here, is Popwa. Popwa was a famous golfer. He could have been the #1 golfer in the world if he had been given the chance. He beat Gary Player, who at that time was the #1 golfer, who used to beat Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer in the US Open and the US Masters. But when he played Popwa, and Popwa was already 40 years old when he played Gary Player, Popwa beat him. And Popwa had to change his scarf. And he received the trophy outside in the rain because he wasn't allowed to go and get into the golf club. You can move into the next frame. This is Valiama. I just spoke about it. You can see Zumba dancing in the Marikana massacre. You can go to the next one. This is also cut off. A tribute to all the women who toiled, planted the seed, harvested the crop, and sold it in the morning market. Out in the city of Durban. The Durban morning market was the world famous market. which was built by the Indian farmers. It was little small farmers. They grew the crop and brought it every day to the market, and they sold it. It became a world famous market, and it was shut down recently. You can move to the next frame. This is Babita Geokaran. She was a whistleblower just recently, a few months ago, during the COVID crisis. Lots of money was given to the health department to fight this virus. And the money was stolen by very famous politicians, who one of them might actually become the next president of South Africa. And she spoke out against them, and she was actually shot and killed. This is, I think this is the last frame. I thought I might send too many, so I only sent in 8. But I can talk about things in the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Subin. So creative, very, very creative. And I love the way that you chose to express your views through that creativity. Well done. We're very lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us now move on to our next speaker. This will be our final speaker for today. This is Sudechan Reddy, a communication specialist at the United Nations Children's Fund of South Africa, formerly with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the UN Information Center. Welcome, sir. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson. I hope you can hear me.
We're hearing you.
It's late on a Sunday evening. Sorry, am I muted?
We're hearing you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we are hearing you clearly.
Okay. If I can ask Raveen to please put my presentation, if Raveen could please put my presentation up.
Sure.
Thank you. So I'll start. I only have 6 slides, and I would like to keep it quite light, and also maybe to pose a few questions, not necessarily to present very much, but to pose and maybe have us think about a few things. I only have 6 slides, and I'm not a fan of PowerPoint, I must confess. Having said that, I have put one together, so it can be projected on the screen when ready. No pun intended. So firstly, I'd like to thank the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center for this opportunity. Really, what you've done is make the world smaller in many ways, and that's really inspiring. Thank you for that. Thank you for giving people an opportunity to reflect, to discuss, to debate. It's rare, and it's good to have these stories told, so thank you. So we can move slides, please. In terms of myself, I am considered 4th generation South African Indian. My family lineage is South Indian. My maternal grandfather came from a village called Porea in South India, I'm told near Pondicherry. My maternal great-grandmother came from a place called Ghazipur, and that's an interesting story, which I'll touch on a bit later, but my mum and my aunt are tracing her story as we speak with my cousin, and her name was Rajwantia, and they're working on the story of Rajwantia and the gaps that remain about women and indenture in particular, as our earlier speaker spoke about. On my paternal side, my great-grandfather came from Chittoor in Andhra Pradesh. So I say this because I've never felt that I didn't know where I was from. But where I have always wondered is the gaps, the stories of the women of indenture. What were their stories? Why do we know the stories of men far more than women? And that, I think, is something we need to continue talking about, and I hope there'll be more discussion around that. At age 47, I'm not quite a born free. And for those who are not in South Africa, a born free refers to those born in South Africa after 1994, after the advent of democracy. So if you're born in the mid-70s, you certainly are not a born free. But I would consider myself a living free at many levels. because people of my generation are old enough to remember apartheid, to remember the discrimination and the anti-apartheid struggle, which my dad was involved and others in my family, but also young enough to live in a democratic South Africa, to grow up in the 1990s in a world that was opening up and in a country that was opening up. And in doing so, I think the curiosity bug bit. Curiosity around why did our ancestors leave India? What life did they make for themselves in South Africa? And asking a lot of questions that need to be answered. Next slide, please. So when we looked at the topic for this evening, commemorating the arrival, I think one sometimes has to ask, what is arrival? The meaning of arrival is nuanced. Arrival is it's a light word. Your arrival at the airport. This was not a smooth arrival by any means, certainly for the majority of South African Indians. Yes, passenger Indians did come as well, and those are different stories. But for indentured laborers, it was the culmination of a very difficult, arduous journey and the beginning of a life that was going to be ultimately different to what they left behind. So the meaning of arrival is layered. And then there's the other meaning. Do we commemorate 1860? Do we commiserate about 1860? Or do we celebrate 1860? Some would say, what is there to celebrate? People had difficult journeys, women were raped, people died, the conditions were horrific. When they arrived at Port Natal, they were subjugated to all sorts of injustices that continued for decades, and that there's very little that one should be celebrating. Others would say, well, then we should commiserate it. But then you could say, well, is that really a correct term? Doesn't that sort of detract from the successes of South African Indians, the resilience of many in the community, the ability of so many to overcome those very real hardships and challenges and make a better life for themselves? And as Ghulam Wahid's presentation said earlier, the majority chose not to return to India. So is that something we should be commiserating? So maybe we should commemorate it, as you've correctly titled it in the title of this talk. We're commemorating the arrival in 1860. And in preparing for this talk, I also started thinking about how did I first hear about these dates, 16th November, 1860. And I remember it was in the history syllabus in primary school. I went to an Indian school, an all-Indian school, as was the case in the 1980s, a school called Gandhi Desai Malilal Valji. And our history textbook did speak very briefly about the arrival of Indian indentured laborers to South Africa. A few years later, I was the first group of Black and brown students at an all-white school. And I remember being surprised that none of the learners in my group, the white learners, knew about 1860 or anything about how Indians had come to become a very dominant force in that very same city, in Durban. And it got me thinking about what is the situation today? Does history at schools in particular teach the story of indenture? It's something I'm still trying to find out, and maybe there are people on this panel who can answer that question, but I'm curious to know about the story of indenture and does it reach a wider audience? Because obviously I think it should. What also got me thinking, and maybe these are questions to ponder, is I noticed in reading up on this that Fiji, Mauritius, Trinidad, Guyana, Grenada, and so many other countries have commemorative days that mark the arrival of Indians there. South Africa, with 1.5 million Indians, doesn't. And perhaps one could argue, well, we're a far smaller proportion of the population here than in the aforementioned countries. Or are there other reasons at stake? Or is it just something tokenistic and it's not something that we should even be considering? But it was something I thought about. Then there's the contested issue of a monument to indenture. So I know on the 16th of November, people will gather at the beach in Durban and a small ceremony will be held. I know my mum is participating in that. And others have said, well, why is there no monument? Why is there nothing to acknowledge those that have contributed so much? The counter argument is that monuments are outdated or archaic, and then they're not particularly relevant in this day and age, and they don't show the nuance. So I'm not sure. Those are the two questions I put out there because I've been grappling with it myself. Ashwin Desai, in an article in the Daily Maverick, I think a few years ago, said that the monument should be a bunny chow at the Blue Lagoon. So there are all sorts of very different thoughts about what a monument should entail. And then to come back to my point about the history syllabus, this is a story that does need to be told, I believe, to a wider audience. And the story of migration is a global story. I'm a student of African history, and I remember at university learning about the different migrations in Southern Africa, about the movements of people and how it shaped my own consciousness about what home means and understanding people's contexts. So I do hope that discussions like this do reach a wider audience and we get to have more people debate and we don't always preach to the converted. Next slide, please, Ravi. And linked to the sense of belonging is also the sense of identity. And that's key. It's very key to appreciate that. And I don't think we should even go into those arguments of, are we South African or are we Indian? I think those debates, certainly I would say for my generation, most of us are clear. We are South Africans. We are South Africans first. We are South Africans of Indian origin. We may adapt aspects of the culture. Some do, some don't. But our identity is as a fundamental fabric of South African society, integrally part of South African society, but also that we are heterogeneous, we are straight and gay, we are in biracial relationships and interracial relationships and same-sex relationships, we are conservative and we are progressive, we are philanthropic and we are opportunistic, we are conscious and we are disinterested. So, I'm always amused every time there's an election period and people talk about the Indian vote as if we're some sort of homogenous bloc. And I think these commemorative events remind us that we are fundamentally woven into the fabric of South African society with all its imperfections, but we are very much part of it. That is who we are, South Africans of Indian origin. Some may choose to embrace the Indian origin and some may not, but that's the diversity of the country we're in. We're minorities in minorities sometimes, whether it's linguistic or racial or religious or one's sexual preference or anything. You could be a minority in a minority. We are that diverse. And I think in all of this, we must appreciate that we evolve, that our story is not just Gandhi and Gupta's. Our stories are a lot more nuanced and complicated and contested at times. And that's also something perhaps we need to focus on when we remember the arrival of 1860. The next slide, please. When we have these discussions, we also, and I guess it linked to the earlier point, about what is home? Where is home? Home is familiar. Home is where you feel rooted. Home is perhaps where your family or your friends are. It's the space that makes you feel completely or largely at ease. And for myself, it has, and I think it always will be, South Africa. I work for the UN and can work in many places of the world, but this is home. And again, the arrival of 1860 reminds me of why it is home. People who came of age in the 1980s and 90s have had perhaps more opportunity to travel to India, to appreciate what India offers, to appreciate how communities have evolved, to challenge our perceptions and stereotypes, to appreciate that India is changing at such a fast pace. And that's been incredible. it's been really good to have those opportunities to be able to see that sometimes we're guilty of rose-tinted nostalgia in how we look at things. And that's not always very healthy. Nostalgia is a fundamental part of life, but I think we should avoid looking at indenture in a very narrow lens, as everybody being a victim, because not everybody was a victim. People went through incredible hardship, but they were not passive. And that's also an important story to tell. And that's why it's really encouraging that all these stories are being told. And I think my sister and my mum were chatting earlier about why this plethora of literature suddenly, or a lot more than there was before. And Dr. Archery gave us an impressive list earlier around indenture. And maybe it's because third and fourth generations now look back with a considerable degree of hindsight to understand the issues in a more understandable way, to try and question why there's gaps and to fill in those gaps where possible. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, about getting these stories of indenture out to wider audiences to make sure that the story of Indians coming to South Africa is understood, that we didn't just arrive here, that there's a lot of story behind it. There's a lot of history behind it. The story of the world is migration, and it's forced migration sometimes, like slavery, or it's difficult migration, like indenture. And those stories, I think, have to really be told. And there are amazing storytellers on this panel and in this audience. And I hope that will be something we take out of this these discussions. Next slide, please. That does bring me to the end of this presentation. As I said, I was not going to keep it too long, but I would like to thank the Cultural Center for this opportunity. I think our role is always to not just understand and to gain insights, but also to question the narratives that have been given to us at times and to learn from it. And I look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reddy. That was quite a very thought-provoking presentation. And we really appreciate your the approach that you took to your presentation as well. So thank you. And thank you as well to all of our speakers for your time, your effort, and your expertise. At this point in time, I just want to recognize everyone who's looking at us on YouTube. I want to also remind us that the meeting is being recorded live. It will be uploaded later for posterity. We are live streaming on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. If you have a question, a comment, or a contribution, we now invite you to raise your electronic hand. You can use the reactions button at the base of your computer screen, and you can indicate that you want to ask a question by raising your hand. Only then would Robin allow you to speak. So ladies and gentlemen, as we wait for those of you who wish to ask a question, I'm wondering perhaps if we should not take some of those questions that Mr. Reddy would have raised, very important ones. I see Mr. Gopal Govinda would like to say something. Robin, would you please unmute Mr. Govinda? Mr. Govinda, could you please try to unmute and you can go ahead?
Very good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Okay, unmute again.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Very good evening to one and all. What a brilliant session and the presentations. I think it's the last speaker, Mr. Reddy, has actually mentioned a little bit more for what we need to take cognizance of. And I think the presenters that presented gave us a very factual presentation of the documented arrival of indentured laborers. That's the Indian colony. However, most of the presenters will know for a fact that there's been Indians in Southern Africa and South Africa as long as 1800 years ago, not 162 years ago. there's a temple that's in one of the provinces of Mpumalanga that's documented to be in the excess of 1,842 years. Fortunately, I'm part of a research group that's following the Black Bushman tribe. And it's documented that the Indian merchants has been in Southern Africa as long as that. The city population that's currently in India, 892 years in India, is coming from the east side of Natal, more the Ambumbulu area. So there is the arrival of Indians long before the indentured laborers. Probably that is a topic which need to be exposed and also placed in perspective rather than following the documented arrival of the indentured laborers only. Indians has been long in South Africa and Southern Africa long before the indentured laborers. If we can get comments, and I'm prepared with Dr. Kogi to engage with the current research that we are busy presiding over. Thank you.
That's an interesting observation, Mr. Gubender, and we really thank you for bringing that up. We do want to maintain the focus today, which is on those Indians who would have come and their descendants out of the indentured period. But certainly we can investigate, and we would like to perhaps have a conversation about those who would have come before, especially as a result of trade. So we will be calling on you and Dr. Kogi to bring us some more information on that. Great. Are there any further questions? Please feel free to raise your hands to let us know. While we wait for that, I think one of the things that we need to pay attention to is Mr. Reddy's question about whether or not Indian indentureship is taught sufficiently in schools in South Africa. Now, Dr. Mahabir would have, okay, Dr. Mahabir would like to say something, and I suppose we're on the same point, which is about education and the lack of discussions about indentureship. So, Dr. Mahabir, go ahead, please.
Well, no, really, I wasn't going to raise that point, but since you put me on the spot on that point, I have done research, quantitative data analysis, content analysis in the CXC Caribbean Examination Council history syllabus, and it's clear, scientifically clear, that the indentureship and the Indian presence is marginalized in the Caribbean syllabus. It's treated as a footnote, as a sidebar, and we have raised a lot of issues about that in the public sphere, but like everything else, don't take us seriously. But we are still continuing to fight for equity and diversity and inclusion, the study of indentureship. So maybe Professor David Dean, who is in this virtual room, may want to say something about that. But the point I wanted to make is a question really: how much research has been done on the first group of Indians in South Africa who arrived as slaves, as the last speaker pointed out, from 1683 onwards during the Dutch colonial era in 1684. It is estimated that over 16,000 Indians from India were enslaved and brought to the Cape. And from 1690 to 1725, approximately 80% of the slaves were Indians. So I just want to know how much research has been done on Indians as slaves in South Africa. Thank you.
Kogi, would you have any idea? Can you please respond?
Shalima, when we were growing up, our history was projected from the white men. All our textbooks were written by them, and it was as they saw, witnessed, and perceived life and living. So I actually to be honest, don't have much information or knowledge on Indians that arrived in this continent before 1860. Even in our textbooks, Indian history is just a footnote. Well, recently it's been getting some attention. And, you know, now that we, in 2023, history is going to become a compulsory subject in the schools. So the textbooks and the curriculum is being rewritten. And there's been calls now for a greater amount of attention to be paid to indentured history. But I really cannot comment on Indians as slaves before 1860.
Okay, noted. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'd also like to speak to Dr. Govender about it, and you know, maybe we can, because I haven't met him, and you know, we can perhaps exchange some details, and then how we can take this point forward.
Yeah, great. Mr. Govender, would you like to respond to Dr. Mahabir's question?
Unmute. Yes, unmute. Unmute. Ravin, can you unmute?
Mr. Govender. Yes, Mr. Subin, go ahead, please.
Yes, there were slaves long before 1860 in the Cape. They came from Bengal. The governor of the Cape, Simon van der Stel, his wife was Bengali. You get a lot of Afrikaners who are slightly darker skinned, coming from those roots. I forget the name of the lady, but she was Bengali, Simon van der Stel's wife. And he was a very famous governor of the Cape.
Mr. Subin, is there any documented information that you could refer us to?
But that doesn't come from the history of India. It comes from the history of Simon van der Stel. When you read about him, they will tell you that he's wonderful Bengali slave descent.
What's that name again?
Sorry, Simon van der Stel. Simon van der Stel, S-T-E-L.
Okay, all right.
Stellenbosch is actually named after Simon van der Stel. It's a famous place in the Cape where you get your wine.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. Mr. Govender, go ahead, please.
Thank you once again. I will definitely send some of the documented literature to Dr. Mahabir. This has been unearthed, as I indicated, when the merchants 1800 years minted, they were minting gold in the Mpumalanga region, which would be strange to the most of the Indians of South Africa currently. But there's documented gold mines in Mpumalanga where the temple, we're referring to that as old as it is, where they settled. But I will furnish Dr. Mahabir. I will send him the literature together with documented evidence of the Indians present in the excess of 1800 years ago. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We have here a question for Dr. Subin, and that is whether or not you have a published collection that we can access.
You can get it. I actually sold my last book a few weeks ago. I have two books of cartoons at the Smithsonian in Washington, and I have the cartoon I did of when Obama became president. It's in the Smithsonian. Yeah, I'm actually having another book published soon in the new year. It's not just my cartoons, it's my adventures. I lived in Brazil and then I went to New York. And, I had an exhibition while I was an anti-apartheid cartoonist. And then recently I had my school shut down because I was speaking on Jacob Zuma. I did a cartoon of Zuma. There was some Indian families who were corrupt, who came down from India, and they were stealing from the state through the help of Jacob Zuma. and they were called the Guptas. I had a cartoon of the Guptas putting a finger up Zuma's butt and Zuma giving us 2 fingers. And my school was shut down because of that, and I had my windows shot. I used to be an anti-apartheid cartoonist, and then I became, so I picked on corruption, but it seemed like I was picking on African politicians, which was not true. I was picking on corruption. So the book is being done in the new year with my cartoons, with all my adventures, and also I write a lot of quotes, as you've seen from some of my pictures. I do write a few quotes, one-liners, and those are also going to be published. I also worked on an animated movie called Mandela Folktales. We won 4 Best Animated Movie Awards in Chicago, Manchester, Turkey, and Calcutta. And I'm working on the 3 other co-production animated movies in Sweden, New York, and in Nigeria.
Interesting, and congratulations on those awards. Well done. So I'm sure Dr. Kanhai will be reaching out to you.
Okay.
Great. Mani, I'm seeing a comment on the chat, and I wonder if you would like to perhaps unmute and make your statement. Let me just regarding the acknowledgement of the Indian history in schools in South Africa, it is non-existent. There wasn't anything related to the history of the indentureship and their children thereafter. So
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, my comment is correct, because when I went to school, which was way back in the 60s, from primary school right up to high school, and even when I was in university, there was nothing, or there was no history of the Indian indentureship. There was no mention of it at all. The history that we learned was purely about the Dutch, the British, and like we heard the last speaker talk about Simon van der Stel, it was purely about these Afrikaners, or what we call the Dutch and the British. And now what is happening is the face of history is being changed in schools, I've been told, because now what they want to do is get rid of the apartheid history that was in place, and they want to, I don't know if I want to use this term, it might sound strong, but they want to enforce Black history. And all the other races will be erased, kind of. I'm also a liberation struggle fighter, but that's how we say it. If we have to say what we want to say, that's how it is. It is what it is. But yeah, coming back to the Indian history, nothing at all, even now in schools, there is nothing about Indian history, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you for that. Mr. Subin, you wanted to add?
There is a cancel culture of Indian history in South Africa. When I say cancel culture, there was no history anyway, because the history that we have, that we had from the past, came through our grandparents and parents. But the recent history of people who fought in the struggle is not there. What I've done is I just painted a peace mural in the Indian area called Chathra after the rioting that took place in South Africa, in Durban last year in July. And I painted people who fought for peace. I said, we fought for this peace, don't destroy it. And the people that were on that mural were mostly Indians. And I had Mandela, I had Bishop Tutu, I had Lutuli, and I couldn't find other people from different communities. I did find the 4 women who marched in the 1956 March, Freedom March. One was black, one was Indian, one was colored, and one was white. And then that black woman counted as another black person. But most of them were Indians, and I couldn't apologize for that because the Indians were actually punching above the weight. I had Navadina play, I had Fatima Mir, I had Imtiaz Suleiman, I had Ahmed Katrada, I had Kumi Naidu, I had Lenny Naidu, who was killed during the struggle on the border. He was shot by the security police. And then I'm doing a calendar for 2023. It's about all the women who stood up against stupid men. I had the same 4 women from the 1956. So yes, I do say stupid men. Stupid men are destroying the world. If you look at elections in America, there was supposed to be a red, but it never came because women stood up against the Republicans in America in this recent election. And that should happen because if you look at the war in Russia, it's stupid men. I can't believe that they're destroying buildings. If women were in charge, that wouldn't be happening. They won't be sending their sons to get killed in a war. It's just so senseless. And Bolsonaro was removed as president. He was destroying the Amazon forest. And the Amazon forest gives us 1/3 of our oxygen. I wrote a story about oxymorons and oxygen just before COVID. If we had proper oxygen and that, we are actually breathing in toxins. The air that we breathe in is toxic. That's why we couldn't get rid of COVID. If we were breathing in fresh oxygen, we could have got rid of COVID. Because that's what oxygen does. It removes the bad air and brings in fresh oxygen. And these guys, these men for greed, they are destroying the world. And when I did the calendar, I had women who stood up to stupid men. I had Craig's governor who stood up to Thabo Mbeki in parliament because he was using the money that was meant for power plants and education and free lights and free water, and use it for the armed struggle. And she told him to stick his position, and she walked out of parliament. And I had other women in that calendar, and most of them came from the Indian community, and I don't apologize for that.
Well answered.
That will be part of history. Those calendars will become part of history.
Yeah.
And my
And then Dr. Kogi can add to it as well with those stories that she was talking about. So thank you very much for sharing that. We have a comment from Mr. J. Nair. Go ahead, please.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm from the land of the indigenous people of Canada, sitting in Mississauga, Ontario. I had to get into this picture. I'm a student of history. I did history at high school, primary school, university, college, and I even taught history. There's something that some things have been missing, is missing from this discussion. There's lots of research done on the Indian question. And if they go back to the late S.S. Singh's library, you will get an umpteen amount of information of what he did for the Indian question. The other issue that the researcher who found traits of Indians in Africa with the Khoi. That has been found recently, and I don't know how far they're going into it. It's just like them finding the African nation in South India. It's the same phenomenon because travel was in different ways from East Coast to West Coast, India and Africa. So having said that, I am the second generation indentured Indian. My father came to South Africa on the SS Pongola in 1904, and he worked in the railways. And my grandfather, maternal, was a temple builder who built 7 temples in South Africa. He came in as a passenger. So there's a lot of history as far as Indians, the types of work that they came and the reasons why they came into the country. They came in first as indentured, meaning pro the abolition of slavery. They came in as indentured, owned by businesses that brought in the husbands or the families or the males or the females. And they came through into onto the ships and came into Natal, Port Natal at that time. And not only for planting sugarcane, but also working in businesses and working in different types of occupations, because they had expertise from India, South India, Central and Northern India. And having said that, there's enough history that was done in my time, and I am 78 years old today, and my brother did the history. He was in the struggle, we were in the struggle, and we were taught with our parents and grandparents, and I lost my grandmother, maternal, at age 99, and she was from India, and my grandfather was from India. So there's enough history there that can be found of the Indians coming into South Africa. And if you look at different parts of Natal, and then you went into the Transvaal, into the interior, Pietermaritzburg, and then in the Cape area, you'll find enough evidence from different families. And there were different families from different parts of India that composed the structure when the time we fought as the Congress movement under Mahatma Gandhi. So that history is there. And Ila Gandhi will have lots of history because she's got it in the settlement in Inanda, the Phoenix settlement. And if somebody can go to the SS Singh Historical Library, which may be in the 1860 museum, if Selvin has retrieved those, or different history books written by different people who were teachers, high school teachers, Sastry College, Gandhi Desai, and they would find information. And it's a vast history that the Indians assisted in the growth of South Africa. And you've got Nanak Chand, who was mentioned by one of the presenters. He is alive. You can get his background and his historical information, and he will have the fingers in the pie also. And as far as education, while I was teaching there, I remember I used to teach about Mahatma Gandhi. I used to teach about the Indians coming into South Africa as indentured laborers. This was in the 60s. I taught right up to 1976 when I fled South Africa. So having said that, there's lots of people who wouldn't want to say much these days because they're not in South Africa. I can say that because I'm here, I'm in Canada, and I've been doing this for years, for the last 45 years. So going back and forth is this forum. We can bring out what we gave to the Western world from our motherland, India. And a classic example of mentioning who am I was asked by a famous doctor in South Africa, what do I regard myself, because I'm living in Canada? I gave him a description. I'm a second generation indentured Indian. I'm South African by birth, but of Indian origin, now living as a first generation Canadian. That's me. I've moved in different places because of my heritage, my grandparents and my father, and now me and my children will be Canadian, but of South African Indian origin. That's how I would describe us. So having said that, a good presentation needs a lot. Dr. Subin, you've done good work, and I know what you are holding back, but it has to be said. We've done a lot for South Africa, and we have to be part and parcel of the growth of South Africa. So good presentation by all the presenters, and more to be done. And hopefully one day we truly believe in what the Freedom Charter brought to us in South Africa. Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity to give my piece to this presentation.
Mr. Nair, thank you. And did you say that today is your birthday?
I beg your pardon?
You said you are 78 today, meaning today is your birthday?
No.
Oh.
I just celebrated 78 on the 20th of July.
Okay, all right. So thank you very much for sharing with us and for outlining all the different places where information is available on Indians in South Africa. I think one of the important points, though, is that which is raised by Sabina, and she says, thank you very much for being one of those teachers who taught her about her Indian history. The thing about it is, why is that information being taught orally by Indian teachers in South Africa, and it's not contained in the textbooks, and it's not available to non-Indians in South Africa? Perhaps if there were textbooks and indentureship being covered, the story of the arrival of the Indians being covered in textbooks and being taught in the schools in South Africa, you may have a greater level of understanding by those who are non-Indians, and perhaps the violence and so on, which is meted out to Indians in South Africa, could be contained. So let's hear Mr. Varun Singh. Nice of you to join us. Go ahead, Mr. Singh.
Hi, everybody. Firstly, I'm also second generation Indian living in the US. My grandfather actually was the founder and the other grandfather treasurer of Aryan Benevolent Home, which is the orphanage that was started in 1926, I think it was, in Mabel, Durban. However, we are forgetting to mention the great Hindi schools, madrasas, Tamil schools, Gujarati schools that was very prevalent in the early 50s, 60s. These were formalized schools that taught Indian history. So I can tell you, I'm very familiar with all Indian history, and so are my counterparts based on these schools that we had. Now, these are our after-school schools, as you may call it. Our regular schools, which I don't know if it was mentioned, most of them were state-aided schools. What that meant was Indians built these schools, but the states funded it. And they funded most of it, and therefore had a huge control in terms of the syllabus that was studied. Anyways, end of the day, we are what we are simply because of our ancestors, our parents, grandparents, who actually took the time to send us to these schools, bought the books, and therefore a lot of us are knowledgeable about our history because of them. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Varun. You were echoing, I think, what Mr. Nair was saying, and we appreciate your sharing that. The thing is, though, out of those schools that were state funded, how many non-Indians would have attended? Any at all? So the thing is to spread the history far and wide, the same way that we in the Caribbean would have had to study African slavery and to a lesser extent Indian indentureship. I think it's important that we learn about all the different cultures, all the different people that inhabit the various countries. So having said that, ladies and gentlemen, if there are no further questions, I want to say thank you all very much for being with us today. Mr. Subin, Dr. Subin, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, if anyone wants a copy of my calendar, send me your email address and I will send you an IRS file and you can have it printed if you live in overseas. You can print it up to A0. I didn't hear you.
Thank you.
So sorry, Dr. Roseanne Kanhai had her hand up twice, so I'm wondering if she would have wanted to ask a question.
Okay, I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, I had several questions. Some of them got answered, but one just popped into my mind, which is particularly in the Caribbean and particularly in Trinidad, the point has been made very strongly by Dr. Mahabir of the exclusion or the marginalization of Indian history in the syllabus. And then the last speaker, I don't remember, brought to our attention that there are certain schools in South Africa, one of which he attended, that taught Indian history, okay? So my question is, or it's not really a question, just a reflection, the Indian-dominated schools in Trinidad, like Lakshmi Girls or Astra or the Presbyterian schools as well, do they make it a point of somehow carving a space where even though Indian history is not on the syllabus, that they do teach this? Is there room and is there any interest in doing this? It doesn't have to be on the CXC syllabus. Are they willing to, or is there any interest that you know of where, because, for example, I taught at Lakshmi Girls for a while, and we made it a point of teaching some aspects of Hindu religion, okay? And a school can do that. You go to, you'll go to bishops or any of the Catholic schools or the Anglican schools, they make it a point of setting aside religious education, even though schools are not going to be, students are not going to be tested on that, examined on that. Is there any interest in the Indian-dominated schools, Presbyterian, Hindu, Muslim, to carve out a space where they teach Indian history, even though it is not on the syllabus or not in the exams? Do you know if that there's any interest, Dr. Mahabir?
Yes. It's generally, it's universal attitude and trait that students study something only if it's coming for exams. So if it's not on the syllabus, why study it? In their mind, they'd be wasting time because they want to pass the exam, and not only pass, but they want to get high grades. In the Indian dominated schools in Trinidad and Tobago, that's the Hindu, Muslim, and Presbyterian schools, both primary and secondary, a lot is taught about indentureship, which is our history, during in and arrival day. So, and these schools take this national holiday seriously. But the point again is has been taken and pointed out by Shalima. Just as we study slavery, everybody has to study slavery, whether you're of African descent or your grandparents were slaves or not. The indentureship and the Indian history should be in the national syllabus. But I wanted to raise a other point, which nobody, rhetorical question, probably, is the funding for Indian Arrival Day. I have done research and I have written the government, and through the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, they have to provide you with the data you request because it's taxpayers' money. And I have written the government of Trinidad and Tobago quite a few times to provide me the amount of government funding for Indian Arrival Day and the amount of funding for Emancipation Day. And you know, it's chalk and cheese, a few pennies given for Indian Arrival Day, whereas millions are given annually for Emancipation Day. These are two historical holidays. So I want to pursue this form of state injustice, which has been happening for decades in Trinidad and Tobago. By the way, we are almost equal in numbers. Indians are almost equal in numbers to Africa and Trinidad. They're the majority in Guyana. And I think the largest ethnic group also in Suriname. In the English-speaking Caribbean, Indians are the largest minority group. So it's really injustice, and a lot has to be done. A lot of noise have to be made, because it's only noise that brings impact in this place. So we have, and the law, you have to take the government to court for injustice and inequity. Okay, I've said too much, Shalima.
Oh, can I get just a response, Shalima?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you're saying. I completely agree. The only thing I don't agree with is that this is the only way to do it, because I see people like Nanda Subin, his work is invaluable, right? That the kind of work that he's doing,
Yes, that is so, because
it's reaching everybody at the cultural level, even if it's not. I agree. I'm not saying what you're saying. I agree with what you're saying, but I think I really appreciate the artists and the people, the creative people, and the Subin, who are bringing this in a different way. It's not on the syllabus, but it's accessible to everyone. It's like, in a culturally inviting way.
Yes, so we have to
estimate. Yeah, and we should not estimate that this is also history and this is also culture. And this really has a great impact, because you're right. Sometimes you study only for the exam. But when you see a cartoon or a movie, it can be very inspirational. So just giving my comment to Nanda Sudin as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, this can take another dimension. We can probably schedule another Zoom topic on statues and monuments. And you would see in Trinidad and Tobago, where are the Indian statues of heroes and so on? They have to be privately constructed. Sundar Popo, you all know Sundar Popo in South Africa, and Bade Sagan Maharaj, private. The government has hardly built any Indian Indo-Trinidadian statue. So it's a whole discussion again, Shalima. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead. I know you
No, it's discrimination. It's clear. It's clear.
Specific interest in that.
We have to document it.
So let's see if everybody else wants to document it. Those in Jamaica, Shani, I ask you. Sorry, Dr. Mahaber, I'm going to just switch a little bit. Shani was asking about the numbers in South Africa, and we quoted it at the beginning, which was 1.5 million. There are 1.5, as of 2021, 1.5 million people of Indian descent in South Africa. So we are learning now that they may not all be from indentured immigrants. Some of them would have come in or may be descendants of enslaved Indians from the 1600s. And some of them would have been descendants or are descendants of Indians who are considered to be passenger Indians, those who came on as traders after those who were indentured. Kogi, you wanted to add something? Go ahead, please.
So I wanted to say, as of 2022 figures, it is 1.560 million. As of September this year, it was 1.560 million. And the second point is the 1860 Indentured Laborers Foundation is actually in the process of building a statue. And it's going to be placed at the entrance to Verulam. I just wanted to share that, and perhaps when we're about to unveil the statue and have it ready, perhaps I'll inform the Dr. Mahabir and Shalima, so we can have some discussion then with other members with regards to the building of statues and the motivation and difficulties, challenges, etc., etc.
Kogi, is that going to be done this year?
Well, we are in the process of getting the statues built, but it will only be unveiled and be ready for perhaps maybe Feb, March, or April 2023. So yeah, definitely, by January, we will know by when it will be ready. So right now, I can't give a date because it's still in the building process. But the
Right.
land has been given by the local municipality.
Oh, your volume is suddenly very down. We're not hearing you.
Oh, okay.
You're
So
unmuted.
can you hear me now?
Yes, better.
So the land has been given by the local municipality. We have sourced some funding, but we still require more funding. So funding is always an issue. We've got the architect on board, and we're in the process of planning for that. So by January, I'm sure I'll have more information.
Yeah. So Ms. Mani is asking if you got government funding at all for that project. No government funding.
Typical.
Okay.
But it hasn't stopped us from trying. We are filling in paperwork, motivations. We are sourcing private funding, and so it's a work in progress. And Mr. Anand Jairaj, who's been on your program, I think, or an attendee, he is the one heading that project.
Right. Excellent. Okay, so I know you'll keep us posted. Thank you very much for that. All right, so I think we can bring today's program to a close now. So ladies and gentlemen, once again, I want to thank our speakers very, very much. Dr. Subin, Dr. Kogi, Mr. Reddy, thank you so much. And Dr. Ghulam Wahid in his absence. You all have really been very enlightening, and we thank you so much for staying up so late to share with us. Thank you for being here. And thank you to all of our participants. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. So I'll pass you over now to Shakira. Oh, you're welcome. Now it's over to Shakira.
Okay, thank you, Shalama, for being a wonderful moderator again. And remember that we are still looking for more Indian elders over 80 years old to interview live next month for part 3 of this series. And we are asking their children and grandchildren to help us in this oral history project. Thank you all for taking the time to participate, and especially to the speakers. As I've said before, this public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center and the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Davidine. Feel free to contact ICC to publish any of your books that you may wish to have or your reports. And remember that we are kindly asking for you to give us your suggestions as well as donations, and you can contact Dr. Mahabir for further details. Thank you to the advisory and planning team led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir. And thank you also to our IT manager behind the scenes, Ravan Ramsingh, thank you, who have been recording the program and will edit and upload it to our website and to YouTube permanently for posterity. And I know there was someone who was asking in the chat where you can get it. You can check ICC on YouTube. Our topic next Sunday will be a live recording of Eats, Entertainment, and Education with roti making, music, and dance, and interviews. So please like, share, and follow our Facebook page. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyavad.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you so much. Anybody wants to say anything for a few minutes? We have a few minutes of time, so we can chat a little bit for about 5 minutes. Anybody wanted to say anything?
Yeah, can I make a suggestion? Please?
Yes, Rosa.
Yeah. So I'm really appreciating the interviews with the elders, but I have a suggestion. I think that from what I have heard, The suggestions have been a lot about the kinds of food, the kinds of music, the kinds of folk medicine and so on, right? But I remember like my father, if he had been alive, for example, he liked to talk to us about some of the things that were happening.
The recording has stopped.
Can you hear me still?